God is a nuisance to modern man, said Nicolas Gomez Davila, and he's 100% correct. Modern men don't believe in God, not because the existence of God is illogical. It's not because they read Aquinas or Augustine or any of the great Western thinkers, any of the great classics. No. See, God is inconvenient to modern men. Men don't believe in God because, well, if God exists, then that means there is such a thing as absolute truth. That there is such a thing as objective morality. Then that means good people are rewarded and bad people are punished. There is such a thing as divine justice. But if God doesn't exist, then there is no such thing as truth. Everything is relative. You can live your life however you want to live it. And that's a very, very, very easier thing to believe than to believe in God. Does God exist? That's an important question that we have to ask ourselves. Does God exist? Because there are only two possible answers. Yes and no. That's it. There's no maybe. There's no half-assing this question. It's a very binary situation. Right? Only one or the other. Does God exist? So let's examine no. Let's say God doesn't exist. Alright then. And if God doesn't exist, then that means there is no such thing as objective truth. Because God, or at least a role of God, is that of a divine judge. And if God doesn't exist, well, that means there is no divine justice, right? That means good people are not rewarded and bad people are not punished when they die. All right then. And if that's the case, what point is justice in the temporal world? There is no point. In fact, is it even justice? If there's nothing that's acting as its foundation, if there's no set of values or principles that are guiding civil justice, then what is there even such a thing as justice if God doesn't exist? Science. The atheist loves science. In fact, the atheist is the most fervent believer in science and the scientific method. That's fantastic. But if God doesn't exist, then what's the point of science? And I say that because what is the purpose of science? The purpose of science is to study the natural world and to grasp the reality of the natural world, the truths of the natural world, if you want to call it that. But if God doesn't exist, if he who is the source of truth doesn't exist, then that means truth doesn't exist, truth is relative. So then what's the point of trying to be factual? What's the point of trying to actually find the truth in the natural world? It all becomes meaningless. What's the point of having order in society if God doesn't exist? If God doesn't exist, then that means we are all the result of chaos. And that also means that if God doesn't exist, going back to the first premise, is that, well, if God doesn't exist, morality is relative, then what's the point of maintaining a social order? There is no point. If God doesn't exist, all actions are permissible. Everything becomes relative. And that's a disastrous result. That's not a good thing. And man naturally isn't a relativist. Man naturally knows that there are certain things which are good and certain things which are bad. In fact, all people with common sense, all people with a brain would agree, or at least a healthy brain, would agree that cannibalism is a terrible thing. They would agree rape is a terrible thing. They would agree molesting a child is a terrible thing. They would agree that the killing of an infant is a terrible thing. Strangling an infant to death, for example, is a terrible thing to do. It's a very evil thing to do. Killing 6 million innocent people, pretty bad thing to do, wouldn't you say? 20 million people, pretty bad thing to do. Gulags and starvation camps and gas chambers, all of those things are evil. They're unnatural, right? Especially when you use those things to kill innocent people, very unnatural. But if God doesn't exist, then who are we to judge? If God exists, then truth exists. And if truth exists, then justice exists, because in order to have justice, you need the truth. And if justice exists, then that means there is order. There is hope. See, the atheists, those who do not believe in God, don't believe in God, again, because, well, it's convenient. And one of the excuses they use for not believing in God is, well, you can't prove the existence of God through science. Fair. But what is science? Science is the pursuit of truth in the natural world. Science is the study of the natural world, and yet God does not exist in the natural world. He's not a natural being. He's a supernatural being. So there is no way, really, to use science in order to prove his existence, because science is incapable of doing that. Science is not all-powerful. Science has its limits. Science isn't the end-all. Shocking thing to say in the 21st century. Science is not God. Shocking. But that's the truth. What's also interesting is that you can't prove science with science. You can't prove the scientific method with the scientific method. You can't prove the existence of truth with the scientific method, which is the whole entire point of science. But if the truth doesn't exist, then what's the point of science? In conclusion, the only possible answer to that question, the only logical answer to the existence of God is yes. Because everything else is, well, relative. And relativism is absolutism in disguise. The only difference is that relativism ends in total self-destruction,